So now we really learned a lot about Next.js. And at some point, you will have a website, a project that is ready for deployment. We reached that point in this course now, and therefore in this course section, we are going to explore how exactly we deploy a Next.js application. And with that, I don't just mean that we learn how to move it to some server, but that we also explore the steps you should go through before you put your application onto some server. In detail, in this course section, we are going to explore different deployment options you have when working with Next.js. So different ways of building your application actually. We are also going to explore the configuration options you have for your project, how you can change the configuration, and how you can prepare your project for deployment. And then, of course, we're going to get our hands dirty and we are going to deploy our example blog website from the last course section after we prepared it so that we see that in action as well. Now, before we get our hands dirty, let's understand deployment in theory. And let's start with the different deployment options Next.js gives you. Because it turns out that you have two totally different ways of building and deploying your Next.js app. The first and most common option is the standard build, as I like to call it. But we also can actually do a full static build and deploy our site as a full static website. Now let me explain what these two options mean. You do a standard build by running the next build command, or in your project where you have a package.json file, this build script which runs next build under the hood. We saw that command in action earlier in the course already when we talked about static page generation and so on. When running this command, Next.js produces an optimized production build, optimized production bundles for your application, and very important, it spits out a server-side application. The result of running next build is an output that requires a Node.js server to run it. So you can't take the output of next build and put it onto some static host. You would be able to do that for a standard React app, a non-Next.js app, but because Next.js has these built-in server-side capabilities, like pre-rendering pages on the fly on the server, revalidating pages, API routes. Because it has these server-side features, it needs a Node.js server to run that code. Should make sense. Now, don't get me wrong, pages will still be pre-rendered during the build process, if possible. So if you have pages with get static props or with no data at all, those pages will still be pre-built when you run next build. But you still have the Node.js server, as I just explained, for your API routes, which can and should only run on the server, for server-side pages that use the get server-side props function, and for page revalidations, which you might want to perform on your statically rendered pages. You also need a Node.js server for dynamic pages with get static paths if you have fallback set to true or blocking, because then some of the pages will be created on the fly when requests are reaching the server. And you need a server that is able to do that for that as well. So that is why you need a Node.js server for running the output next build gives you. And that has implications. It means that when you deploy that output, you need to deploy it onto a host that is able to run Node.js. And we're going to see that later in this course section. Now, when deploying a site, an application, you also typically need to redeploy from time to time. And when doing a standard build, you need to redeploy whenever your code changes, of course, because you want your latest code to be in effect in production. But you will also need to redeploy if your content changed, and you need to re-render some of your pages because you're not revalidating them on the server, because you haven't added that revalidate setting in get static props. Then if you have such pages, as we for example have them in our blog application here, in our blog site, there I have pages where I pre-render the pages with some data and I don't revalidate. If you have such pages, which is no problem, but if you have such pages, you will also need to redeploy whenever the content that influences those pages or that impacts those pages changed. Now that's the standard build which you get with Next build. For some projects, the full static build is a good option though. You get that by running next export, another command. We could run this in our project by adding a script for that. Here in package.json, we could add an export script, or however you want to call it, where we then run next export. Now, next export does something totally different than next build. It also produces an optimized production version of your application, but it produces a 100% static application, which means only HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, no server-side code, and therefore for hosting such a website, you don't need a Node.js server. Which makes hosting easier because you don't need to worry about scaling and so on so much, because there are plenty of static hosts out there which scale dynamically and are very cost effective. So having a static app which doesn't require a Node.js server isn't too bad. It can definitely make deployment a bit easier. But next export isn't always an option. Since it spits out a 100% static app, there are certain things, certain Next features, which you just can't use in such an application. For example, you can't use Next Export if your site relies on API routes, on server-side pages with get server-side props, on page revalidations, or if you have static paths with fallback set to true or blocking. All those things require code to execute on demand for incoming requests on the server. And therefore it's difficult if you have no server. So Next Export only works if you have a page which doesn't need any server-side code. Now, when building a page with Next Export, you have to be aware of the fact that that means that you need to redeploy your application whenever your code changes, but also whenever any content changes. Since you can't use page revalidations and fallbacks and so on, you need to redeploy whenever any content changed, because you'll need to export your application again. You need to rebuild all the pages again. Again, that might not be a disadvantage. That can be perfectly fine for a simple blog, for example. There, you add a new blog post every week. You do a redeployment every week. Not too difficult, just one step. And then Next Export can be a great option. In the blog application we built in the last course section, Next Export wouldn't be an option at the moment, because we're using API routes, for example, and because we're also using revalidations in some pages. And these are all features that require a Node.js server, since these are all tasks which will execute after deployment on the server for incoming requests. Nonetheless, these are your two options, and we are going to see both options in action in this course section. So now that we know how we can build our site and what the implications are, let's take a look at general deployment steps and considerations, no matter how you will build your site. The first step should always be that you double check all your pages. You make sure you added all the head metadata to all your pages, titles, descriptions, whatever else you might need. Of course, you want to optimize your code, remove console log statements, shrink it as much as possible, things like that. And you want to remove unnecessary dependencies and make your code as small and optimized as possible. So that is step number 1. Now, once you did that, there is another kind of related step which I still want to list as a separate step. You want to double check your configuration, and you especially want to consider working with environment variables for data that might not be the same during development and during production. For example, in our blog application, we have an API route where I connect to a database, and at the moment, the way I connect here is always the same. My connection string is hard-coded in the API route. So I always use the same user, the same cluster, the same database. It's more realistic that I want to use some development dummy database during development and switch to a different database and maybe also an entirely different cluster and user for production. And therefore we want to swap this connection string dynamically depending on the environment in which we're running. And that is something where environment variables will be able to help us. Another use case could be API keys, if you're using the Google Maps SDK, for example. These are things which you might want to manage with environment variables. And therefore, that is of course also something we're going to explore in this course section. Now, once you did all of that, you should do a test build and test your production-ready app on your local machine. Since you just need a Node server for running it, and we already have Node.js installed, building and running the application is rather straightforward. And we should do that to make sure that everything works, that we're happy with the file sizes, with the code bundle sizes, and so on. Now, that step, of course, can involve that you go back to step 1 and implement further optimizations. Now, once you're happy with all of that, then it's time to finally deploy. That is roughly how the deployment process will look like. And that, therefore, is the process and the list we will go through over the next lectures. Now let's start with step number 1 in this lecture. Let's double check our code and verify that we're happy with it. Now for this, I'm back in this blog project, which we worked on in the last course section. If you didn't follow along there, you find my latest snapshot attached. Just be aware that the MongoDB credentials I'm using here won't work for you. This is my cluster, and I invalidated this user and its password after recording this course, so you will need to bring your own MongoDB database and your own connection string to make that API route work. Other than that, you can continue with what I shared here as an attachment, and therefore now we want to double check this setup and see if we're happy with it. Now, of course, such a validation is an ongoing process and you will always find improvement potential, but generally, what we have here shouldn't be too bad. We are, for example, already using NextImage, so the optimized images in all the places where we are working with images, even in our post contents. Even there, we make sure that images that are part of our posts are rendered with NextImage. And that is a great optimization because that loads images only when they are needed, it loads them lazily, and it also shrinks them in size. Now, speaking of lazy loading, that also is a concept we know in general in React. And most prominently, when working with just React without Next.js, you might want to lazy load your routes, so that the code for a given page is only downloaded if you're visiting that page, and it's not downloaded if you not visit the page. The great thing here is that Next.js has this kind of lazy loading built in. You don't need to worry about it. Your different pages, which we have here, are already lazy loaded, so the code for them is only fetched on demand when we visit a page. So that built-in lazy loading is a very nice feature to have. Now regarding the metadata which we should add, I'm happy with the amount of metadata like title and this description tag I added in the last course section. Of course, there is more you might want to add. Fav icons, images which are displayed if you share a page through Facebook or Twitter, so these little preview images and so on. These are all extra kinds of data you could add into your head section, but for this demo here, for this project, the current amount of metadata which we added is fine for me. And therefore, at the moment, I'm happy with that code. I think it should be fine. But we will soon revalidate this by doing a test build, of course. Nonetheless, for the moment, let's move on to the next step. Now, step number 2 is about those environment variables. And that's a very useful feature since it allows us to use different values in parts of our code during development and production. And Next.js has built-in support for environment variables. Now, to explore them, I actually want to explore another concept first, though. We can configure Next.js. Up to this point, this Next.js project worked with all the default settings Next.js assumes. And these are sensible defaults, which often make sense. But maybe you want to fine-tune them. And you can do this by adding a special file to your project, a next.config.js file. This is a special file which has to be named like this and which has to sit in your root project folder if you add it. And it's a file which exports a JavaScript object with this Node.js export syntax. If you never worked with Node.js, you might not know this syntax. This is in the end the equivalent to export default in front-end JavaScript, so to say. So we export such an object here. And that's now an object which allows you to set various configuration options. Now, if you Google for next config, you'll find the official documentation on that config file. And here you learn all about that file and what you can configure there. You can configure a lot here, but for most of the settings, the defaults are fine. But you can, for example, add environment variables, something we'll do in a second. You could add a base path if you're hosting your Next website not on the root level of some domain, but in some nested path. You can set up rewrites and redirects if you have some hard-coded redirects which should be taken into account when the application is deployed, and much more. You can inject your own Webpack configuration to really tap into that build process. You can disable compression. It's enabled by default, but you can disable it if you don't want to use it for whatever reason. Compression will make your JavaScript files and so on smaller, so you should enable it by default, and much more. So you see there are a couple of things you can set, but to be honest, most of the settings will rarely be needed, and you will know when you need them. The most helpful settings are probably redirects and custom headers and environment variables and the base path. For this project, though, we need no rewrites, we don't need to change the base path, we don't need any custom headers, but we will explore environment variables. And the idea really is that in our API route here, we swap out some of these values here from this connection string for dynamic values, which can then differ between development and production, so that we can have a development database connection and a production database. And we don't delete or manipulate production data with our development tests. And to make that work, I'll go to that next config file and add the env key. That's also what you see in the official docs here. This allows you to set up key value pairs of your choices, and you will then be able to use your keys in your code, both in the API routes as well as in any other component. So you can use your environment variables anywhere in your code base. So here, I'll set up a couple of environment variables, and I'll start with MongoDB username. Now, how you name that variable is up to you, but I'll name it like this. And set this to Maximilian. Then add the MongoDB password and set this to the password I have here in my connection string. Then I'll add the MongoDB cluster name. And here I will use this cluster 0 thing here, so that if I had multiple clusters in my account, I can use different clusters for different environments. So I'll add this here. And then I'll also add the MongoDB database key. And here I want to grab that database to which I'm connecting, my site, and set this here. Now you might be wondering why I'm doing this here. What's the benefit? The benefit is that now we can tap into those values. We'll do that in a second. And when we then deploy our application, we can override these values. And you'll see how we can override them in a couple of minutes once we deploy. And therefore, we now need to switch to using environment variables. So back in the API route, I'll now set up my connection string here in a separate constant, simply to make it a bit easier to work with it. And I'll set up a template literal here, because now I need to mix hard-coded and dynamic values. And I'll still start with that MongoDB plus SRV part here. But then after the 2 slashes, I want to inject the value from my environment variable, from that MongoDB username environment variable. And here we see in the official docs that we get access to those values by tapping into the global process variable, which is exposed by Node.js, then .env, and then into the key name of our choice. Now this placeholder will be replaced with the concrete value during the build process. That's important. So this will not be resolved dynamically after we build the app, but it will be swapped out during the build process. And that allows us to replace it with our environment variable value, and it allows us to use different values for building for production than during development. But again, we're going to see this in a second. So therefore now, in contact.js here, I now want to use process.env.mongodb username here. Then we have a colon here. So this is hard-coded, and thereafter the password, which we get from process.env.mongodb_password. And here I'm using the keys I set up in my env part of that configuration. Now we also want to replace the cluster and the database. So back here in contact.js, now we have an @ after the password. And then the cluster name. So here I want to tap into process.env.mongodb cluster name. Then thereafter I have this hard-coded part. So I'll add that here again. And then inject process.env.mongodb database. And then thereafter add this query parameter. Like this. Okay, so now that's our dynamic connection string. That's now what I'll use here for connecting, the connection string. And now here we use environment variables. Now that should work. If I now start the development server again with npm run dev, we should again be able to successfully test everything. Specifically, I should still be able to send a message here. This should still work. Let's see. Send message. Success. And we got no error here either. So that works. And now we're using environment variables. Now, environment variables are only helpful if we don't always use the same values. And at the moment, the only thing we did is that we moved these hard-coded values from contact.js into next.config.js. But there, they are still always the same. At the moment, we don't differentiate between production and development. Now, there will be certain hosting providers which allow us to push our code to them, and then they will do the build for us, and then there we can define different environment variables. which they should use during the build process. And we'll see an example for this later. But we're not necessarily always using a hosting provider that does the build for us. And therefore, in Next.config.js, we can actually define different values for the environment variables for the different phases we might be in. To be precise, when we run npm run dev to start the development server, we clearly are in development. Our current phase is development. If we run npm run build, though, to trigger the next build script, or if we run the export script, which I explained a couple of minutes ago, then we are clearly building for production, because that's the idea behind next build and next export. So then our phase is production. We want to use the production values. And because we have this clear way of telling Next.js whether we're building for development or production, Next.js allows us to define different sets of configuration values for development and production. For this, we just need to import something, and we do this with this strange-looking import syntax, which is the default Node.js import syntax. And we have to use it here in this config file because this config file is read in a way that other import statements won't work yet. Here we need to import from next constants, and make sure you import exactly like this with the require function on the right side of the equal sign. And then here we can import different phases. To be precise, we have the phase development server, which will be used if we run npm run dev. We have the phase export, which will be used if we do that export command. And then we got the production build and production server. Production build will be used if we run npm run build. And production server will be used after that build for the server-side code once our server is up and running. So what we could do here is we can import that phase development server and then utilize the fact that our exported thing here in this config file can be an object, but can also be a function. And I'll change this to a function which returns this configuration object then. So we move that into this returned object now. And I'm doing this because when using the function form, we can add an if check to check in which phase we are. So if this configuration is loaded for the development server or for production. And we can find out in which phase we are because this function here will be executed by Next.js and it will get the phase parameter. And then we can check if the phase for which this config file is being read in, if that is equal to phase development server. And then we can say if that's the case, if we are in development, then we want to return a different config object than we do otherwise. So now here, I'll grab these settings and add them here. And now that's my configuration object for this Next.js project if we are in development. If we make it past this if check, we are not in development. And in all those cases, I could now set up different values here. For example, I could use a different database. I could say here, I'm not using my site, but my site dev during development, and then I use my site in production. If we change everything like that and we save this file, if I start the development server again with npm run dev, then we'll see that if I reload this context page and I now do test this again, it should still work. But if I then log into MongoDB and explore my collections, what we'll see is that once this loaded here, that we now have this my site dev database with a messages collection, and that collection contains our one message. For some reason it doesn't load here for me, but we can see that there's one document in there, and we can clearly see that it's the right database name. So now we're using this during development, and we'll use different settings for production. And that allows us to not accidentally override or mess with data from our real users during development. And that is why environment variables can be very useful and are another feature you should be aware of. So now that we did add environment variables, before we get to deployment, it's time to do a test build on our local machine and see if we're happy. And for this, I opened the terminal again, and now I want to run this build command, which builds our application for production. And if we run npm run build, this production optimized build is being produced, and we also get useful information shown to us here. We see, for example, which pages are built for the server, which pages are 100% static, these with the empty dot here, and which pages are dynamic but were statically pre-generated. And we see that output here, and that's all looking good. We get the starting page pre-generated, 404 was added for us automatically. Contact page is 100% static because we don't fetch any dynamic data here. And then we got posts and the post detail pages, which were also pre-generated. But here we see an issue. This is red because this posts detail page, these pages are too big. They contain too much JavaScript. We could deploy it. It wouldn't break. But this is a clear indicator that we might be doing something in those pages which is not optimal. We might be shipping too much code. And very often that means that you're using some third-party package, some third-party library that is too big. So therefore, before we deploy something, let's fix this issue. And for this, let's have a look at the detail page. Now this slug page here is certainly not too big. It doesn't have a lot of code. We also can ignore any code which is only needed in getStaticProps or getStaticPops. That code will only execute during the build process and on the server anyways. That will never end up on the client, and the code here, this size, refers to the client-side code. So we can ignore server-side code. So this component should be fine. Therefore, let's explore the post content component. Here, we also don't have too much code on our own, but we are using a couple of third-party packages. React Markdown and this syntax highlighter. And now you would have to dig into those packages and find out how big they are. And I can tell you that our problem here is React Syntax Highlighter. This is huge. If you visit the React Syntax Highlighter GitHub repository, then you actually find out that they tell you that it's quite big and that they offer a light build because the React Syntax Highlighter can have a fairly large footprint. But the solution is simple. We can use the light build basically as it is described down there. The difference between the light version and the version we're currently using is that this version, out of the box, supports syntax highlighting for all possible programming languages. That might sound nice, but it is quite redundant and it adds a lot of JavaScript code. In reality, we are probably not going to include C++ code snippets here if we are blogging about web development. And hence, using the light build and explicitly stating the languages we want to support is probably the better choice here. And that's what we can do. We can also import the styling in a slightly optimized way. So therefore, what I'll do here is I'll import Prism Light as syntax highlighter instead of Prism. And I'll import my styles differently by diving into style/prism/Atom Dark and then importing Atom Dark like this. This will also only import that style then and no other styles. And now we need to import the languages which we want to support. And we do this by importing from React Syntax Highlighter /dist/cjs/languages/prism/ and then we have different options like JavaScript, for example. And then we could import this as JS, whatever you want. And we could, of course, also duplicate this and, for example, also import CSS if we want to support this as well. And you can simply add all the languages you want to support. So all the languages which you'll use in your code snippets typically. Then you just need to register those languages simply by calling syntax highlighter register language, and then the identifier, for example, JS. That's the identifier which I also use in my markdown code here. So we need to import that identifier. And then as a second argument, that imported language. And I'll repeat that for CSS here. And with that, we should have a much lighter footprint. If we now run npm run build again, with those changes applied, it will build our site again and produce all those files again. And now we'll see that this is much smaller. It shrank from 320 kilobytes to 114 kilobytes. And it's also worth noting that these sizes are before compression. But Node.js will compress these files. So once they are served, they are much smaller. And therefore that should be fine. Now let's also test if that looks good though. So let's start the dev server to see if our changes broke something. And go to posts, and then that post which has that code snippet. And that still looks all right here if we have a look at it. So that is working. Now we have that syntax highlighting, but with a smaller footprint. And that's why checks like this are important, and why you should always validate your code and see if you can improve it. And even here, you might find other third-party packages which have an even smaller footprint. You might find different ways of highlighting syntax. There might still be ways of improving this even more. But we already gained a lot here, and we now have a size that's okay. And therefore now with that, I think we're ready to actually deploy this. So it is time to deploy, and we have two deployment options here, as we learned. Now, only the standard build makes sense for our project here at the moment because we are using server-side features like API routes or page revalidations. And therefore, I will now again run npm run build to produce this production output, even though we just did it, but still, I'll now do that. And now that gives us the .next folder. That next folder contains this production output. Now, how would we deploy our page then in the end? Well, in the end, you can take your entire project folder and just move that onto a Node.js server, so onto some remote computer that supports Node.js. And then on that machine, you would run npm install to install all dependencies again, and then npm start. npm start runs next start, and that will then use that build output and bring up the production server. So npm start brings up the production server. And we can test this locally here. If I run npm start, I'm now again hosting this on localhost 3000, but this is now the production-ready application. So now if I reload this page here, it still works as before, but that's actually already the production-ready app. And as you see, it's super, super fast, really good to use. So that's now production-ready. And that is what we would deploy and do on some other computer as well. And therefore, you can use any hosting provider that supports Node.js. Just upload your project code, run npm install on that provider's machine, and then npm start. And then make sure that internally you forward port 3000 to port 80 to the outside world. Now, the exact steps for that will always differ based on which hosting provider you're using. Now, a very good hosting provider for Next.js is Vercel though. Vercel is a service of the same company that developed Next.js. And that's why Vercel is highly optimized for Next.js, and vice versa, I guess. So you don't have to use Vercel. You can host Next.js on any node server, as I explained, but Vercel makes hosting Next.js applications very, very easy, especially when it comes to topics like scaling and so on. Though I will say that there also are options like Netlify, which also have great Next.js support built in and which also make hosting and scaling Next.js applications simple. So definitely check out the docs of that. I will use Vercel as an example here though, also because we can get started for free and we don't even need a credit card. Now definitely check out their pricing if you plan on using it for a real site. You can get started for free, but at some point it will cost you money if you use certain features and so on. But here, for our purposes, we can use the free option. And all we gotta do for that is sign up with them and create a new account. And for this year, we now need to sign up with GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket. And that makes sense because you will need one of these free options for deployment anyways. So therefore, before we continue here, let's first of all understand why we need one of those options. When deploying your Next application to Vercel, you deploy it such that you push your code to a remote repository on GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket, which are simply remote Git repository providers. GitHub, of course, is the most well-known one, I would argue. And then once your code is on such a remote depository, you can easily connect it to your Vercel account and tell Vercel that whenever the code in that repository changes, you want to redeploy. And that makes redeploying super simple then, because all you have to do is you have to push your latest code to GitHub. And therefore, that is what we will do here. Now, you need to have Git installed for this, which is a version control system, and you can get it for free from git-scm.com. You don't need to know anything about Git to follow along here. For the moment, it's enough to install it. If you want to learn more about Git, though, we have a course on that, the Git and GitHub course, and we also got a free Git for Beginners tutorial, which you can explore. So that might be worth a closer look if you want to learn more about Git. But here, just installing it and following along is enough. So once you installed Git on your system from that page, by simply downloading it and walking through the installer, you should be able to use the Git command here in your terminal. And then as a first step, you want to run git init. I'm not going to run it here because I am already using Git in this project. But what git init will do is it will basically just put this project under Git's control. Now, once you ran git init, you want to run git add dot and git commit some message, maybe a more meaningful message describing what you changed since your last git commit, to create a code snapshot with Git. So here I'll say prepared for deployment like this. Now your output might differ here because I already did commit before. But if you're committing for the first time, you'll see some confirmation that it worked. Now this simply saved all your code files in a Git snapshot. And you can have multiple snapshots, you can go back to an older one if you mess things up, and so on. By default, that will all happen in a branch named main. Here I'm in a different branch because I have different branches for the different course sections, but I did now switch to the main branch as well, and therefore I am in that branch at the moment. So now you are in the main branch. You can confirm this by running git branch, and you should see main selected. You're in the main branch, and you did add such a code snapshot. That means your code is now saved with Git. As a next step, you need to create a GitHub account. You can do that for free by simply Googling for GitHub, going to github.com, and sign up for GitHub. Again, you can do that for free. So let me quickly sign in with my account here. And once you did sign in, you can create a new repository. Now here you can give this repository any name of your choice, and I'll go with Next.js course. But the name is up to you. You can give it an optional description, and you can choose whether it should be public or private. Both is possible, and here I'll go with private. And then click Create Repository. Now no one except for me will be able to see that. Now we can grab that link here, which we see here, and go back to our project, and now run git remote add origin and then paste in that URL. This sets up a connection between your local Git repository, so between your local project and that remote repository. Once you did that, you can run git push origin main to push the main branch to that repository. And that's what we'll do now. Now, if you are getting a repository not found error message here, which you very well might, you need to include your login credentials into that remote URL. For this, we can remove that remote repository with git remote rm origin. And once you did that, run the add command again, but with a twist. Now you want to go to your GitHub account, and there to settings, and there to developer settings, and here to personal access tokens. Click on generate new token there, and add any node you want, like local development. And then make sure that under scopes here, you select repo. Also admin repo hook and delete repo. And then generate this token. Now that token will never be shown to you again, but you can always generate a new one. And you should therefore now copy it. And now, when you add your remote repository again, add a @ symbol in front of github.com, and then add your username here in front of that. So your GitHub username. And I will do that real quick. And then try pushing again by running git push origin main. Now you should be prompted for your password, and there you can use your GitHub password, though that method is deprecated and will stop to work in the future, and therefore instead you should use your token. And once you did that, the code should be pushed successfully to GitHub, which means it's now uploaded to that remote repository. And if you revisit your repository, if you reload that repository page, you should see your code here. And now with that, we're ready to connect it to Vercel and deploy our application. For this, back here on Vercel, we now want to continue with GitHub here and sign up with GitHub and give Vercel these permissions. And now here we need to import a Git repository. So we need to connect Vercel to the repository that holds our code. And for this, I'll click on that drop down here, click on add GitHub org or account. And then I'm prompted to give Vercel access to the repository of my account here. And we can give it access to all repositories or only the repositories we know we want to grant access, like in this case, the Next.js course repository. And I'll do that and click install. And now here, I can import that repository into Vercel. So that's what I'll do here. And I'll select my personal account here so that I can use that free deployment option. And now we end up on this screen. Now it detects that we have a Next.js application here, but we could also use Vercel for deploying other kinds of apps. It's very versatile, as you can tell. But of course, we want to go with Next.js here. We can edit the root directory in case we would have our code in some nested directory, but we don't have that here. We can tweak some settings. For example, we can tell it that we want to build with npm run build, and we could change this. And I'll also stick to the default output directory. And we can override environment variables. And that is interesting because that allows us to define production environment variables without using that config file for that. Now here, with our setup, we are already using different environment variables in production, so we don't need to add them here again. But instead of having separate environment variables here for production, we could also inject our production values here in this Vercel console. But again, I will go with the setup I have in a config file, hence I'll leave that empty and click on deploy. And now Vercel will build our application and then start it. And it will automatically build our pages and pre-render the pages. It will host those on a CDN then, which is optimized for speed and has great caching settings. And it will then also take our API routes and put those into serverless functions, which are executed on demand and scale infinitely in a cost-effective way. So it's a great deployment option, and we don't need to do anything else to make it work. So let's now wait for this deployment process to finish here. We see the same output as we did locally. Now it's basically wiring everything up with the Vercel's servers and machines. And looks like it's about to be done. Here we go. It's deployed, and now we can click Visit, and we see our application running in the web. And as you see there, everything works just as it worked locally. So that is working, and now it is hosted in the web. It's not hosted locally, and we hosted it with Vercel. Now you can go to the dashboard here and then configure more things here. You can assign a custom domain, you can monitor it, you can dive into the logs, explore certain analytics, dive into the settings and configure it, and do things like that. Definitely play around with those settings and those options if you are using Vercel for your production-ready app. Now, the great thing is that if we now want to change something, let's say in our contact form, I want to change the text in the success notification. I want to add a couple of exclamation marks. Then we just make that change. We then create a new git snapshot with git add and git commit. Changed notification message sounds like a good note here. And then we push again by pushing main to origin. And when we do that, when we make that push, Vercel will automatically recognize that. It automatically recognizes this and starts building again, as you can see here. So it recognizes pushes to main, because that is the connected main branch here. And whenever the code in that branch changes, it will rebuild and redeploy our application, which is of course pretty amazing and makes redeploying a breeze. So let's wait for that rebuilding here to finish. Here we go, looks like it's done. And then visit the updated page, which is of course served on the same domain. And now here, if we give this a try to see if everything works, does that work? If I send a message, I get an error, could not connect to database. And why are we getting this error? Well, you could think that it's a problem with our environment variables, but that's not the case. We did set those in our config folder, in our config file. But keep in mind that we're using MongoDB Atlas. And here we need to control who's able to connect. We do this under network access. And we added our local IP address, but now it was deployed. And now to ensure that this deployed application, which is running on some remote server, that this can connect to MongoDB Atlas, we need to add another IP address. And if we know the IP of the server, we could add that. But since we don't know it, we want to allow access from anywhere. We still have the password username protection in place. But we need to enable all IPs to connect to ensure that our deployed application also can connect. Otherwise, all these environment variables don't do anything if we block the connection from MongoDB's side. So let's wait for this update to be in effect here on MongoDB Atlas so that all hosts can connect to this database. And once this is done, let's try sending this message again. And now we have a success and we see all the exclamation marks. So now that works. And that's how we can deploy our next application with npm run build with that server-side code with Vercel. It's not the only option, but as you saw, it's very, very easy to use it. Now, before we explore the export option, there is something I want to talk about and highlight. And that is our config file with the environment variables. We are using that file for our development and production environment variables. Now, this file is part of our GitHub repository. Here it is. And it needs to be so that Vercel is able to read that file after deployment. The problem with that could be, though, that this file can be read by anyone who has access to your repository. Now here it's a private repository, but if you're working in a team, that could still mean that other team members can view it. And this might or might not be a problem. I just want to make you aware of that. You should make sure that you only include this config file in your GitHub repository if you can rule out that unauthorized personnel or unauthorized people are able to view that file. If you can't rule out that that's the case, you should not include this config file here. And instead, for production, you should set environment variables through that environment variables feature Vercel offers. And all hosting providers offer built-in environment variable support. So you want to use that instead of using the config file for environment variables if that file could be read by people that should not have access to the data in the file. Here, for this use case, it's okay. It's my private repository. But still, we want to rule out that we run into problems here, and hence you should be aware of this potential security issue. Now, we did talk a lot about deployment, and it matters, and we did talk a lot about this standard build with Next build. And that works and is the standard build for a reason. It's easy to use and easy to deploy, especially when using a service like Vercel, as you saw. But I did also mention this alternative, Next export. We can't run it like this, but we can go to the package.json file and add a script for that. Like this. And here I created a brand new basic project, which you find attached now. It's a very basic project, which only has one page, which does nothing special. And whenever you have a project that needs no server-side code, so no page revalidations, no fallbacks, no server-side props, no image optimization. That also requires server-side code because it's done on demand, on the fly. If you have such a project, so if you downloaded the attached project and run npm install in there, then you still need to run npm run build first. So this regular build command, you still need to do that first. But once that's finished, you can now run that export command, which I added to the package.json file, and this will now create such a static export. In this out folder, you now have everything you need. So you can take the content inside of that out folder and deploy that onto any static host. And you don't need anything else. You don't need a node server, nothing like that. But you have the limitations mentioned before. But that is an alternative for some pages which don't use any server-side features, and then you get a super slim static application which you can deploy, and all you need then is a static host. So that is something which you probably won't use that often, but which can be very useful for some applications and some projects, and which I therefore, of course, also wanted to cover here. And with that, that's it for this module. Now we had a detailed look at deployment, we had a detailed look at how we can deploy to Vercel, and which steps should be taken into account when it comes to deployment, which potential pitfalls you might be facing, like with MongoDB Atlas and the IP address problem, or with the too big bundle size when we used the syntax highlighter incorrectly. It's things like these which you should be aware of, and therefore hopefully this module helps you with deploying your own projects.